Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Art in the Wild. I don't have a lot going on for my part of the intro where I usually talk about what I've been doing. I've been looking for more saw-whets, gotten completely skunked the entire season so far, but I have, well, skunked in terms of saw-whets. However, I did find a pair of great horned owls. Well, I found one of them, and then another one appeared out of nowhere after the sun had gone down, so it was a pair. And then I refound a screech owl that I found a few years ago while also looking for saw-whets. I thought it had gone away because I haven't seen it there for years, so I thought it was just not in the area anymore. And then I was checking the same group of trees for saw-whets because it's a very dense group of cedars or whatever species of tree it is, and all of a sudden it was just a screech owl looking at me. So yeah, that, and then also the yellow-billed cuckoo I mentioned earlier. But not a ton going on for me right now. But on this episode, I spoke with Josh Hauge. Josh Hauge is a 19-year-old wildlife photographer based in Maryland. He's always enjoyed nature and wildlife, but he started to get interested in photography a few years ago. It has been a great creative outlet for him and a way to showcase the natural world in a visual and compelling manner. Now, he mainly shoots birds and mammals, however, he really especially shoots bird life along Maryland waterways and the Bay Area. So it was a really good episode. We talked about primarily how he approaches a location. So the creative process of approaching a location, visualizing ideas in that location, making plans for certain locations, things of that nature. It was a really good episode. I liked it a lot, and I hope you guys enjoy. So I will see you over there. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Art in the Wild. I hope you guys have been getting out and doing some shooting. Today, I'm going to be talking with Josh Hauge about a large variety of topics, but mainly revolving around locations. So knowing your location, researching your location, approaching a location in a creative manner, all that good stuff. Before we get into all that, Josh, you've been shooting a lot right now. Has it been dull? What have you been doing?
It's kind of that like dull period a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
But I've been doing some more urban photography. I've been dabbling in that a bit around the
Mm-hmm.
Pittsburgh area. I'm usually out of Maryland, but because I'm in college and stuff, I've been going to Pittsburgh a decent amount and trying to do some shooting there. It's been like mildly successful, but
Yeah,
there's some
yeah.
like random stuff that'll show up, which will be cool with like the city lights and stuff. But yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, it is that rough time of year. I know I talked about this in the last couple episodes. It's just, are you guys getting like any owls down there or any winter waterfowl or anything? Or is it still just rough?
I think some of the winter waterfowl have started a little bit. I haven't had a whole lot of luck with owls, at least here. I'll hear some screeches sometimes, but I
Mhm.
haven't really been. They're always in like weird suburban neighborhoods, so
Yeah.
it's kind of awkward like trying to actually like track them down. But yeah, there's definitely some waterfowl that's been coming in on the rivers and stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think I just saw some like, I want to say buffleheads Reese today driving down the road in like a
Okay.
big pond. We had a barn owl show up by
Oh, no
me,
way.
which was crazy because I've gotten them on Nantucket Island or like Martha's Vineyard Island. So the island's off the coast. There's a lot of them out there. The winter's a lot more mild, but we had
Okay.
one show up in like the one of the most northern points of mainland Massachusetts, and I got to see it. It was and not a great shot or anything, but it was super crazy. I had a short-eared fly
So
over my
cool.
car the other day. It was awesome. It was a blast. But aside from that, yeah, just a weird period of time. We'll just tough it out until more cool stuff comes in. But speaking of
Until the
all of
winter.
that, yeah, yep, exactly, yeah. Now, speaking of all that, how did you actually get into it? Did you like have a really cool encounter with a subject that was like caused you to be like, this is awesome? Or have you always been into animals and then just gradually got into photography that way? How did that work out?
Yeah, so I was always really into wildlife. I sort of like a lot of people really into wildlife, especially birds. They had a
Mm.
couple natural history classes at my school when I was a kid. So I got really into birds that way. And then, yeah, so a couple years ago, I was watching a lot of those BBC Earth Planet Earth documentaries, and
Yeah.
I was obsessed with those. And then I would watch the behind the scenes of the photographers and the videographers there, and I got super into it. And then I was just sitting around one day, and I was like, you know what? What if I tried something like this? Obviously, not really knowing anything about anything. So I went out with like a
Yeah.
point and shoot. It was totally ridiculous going out with a point and shoot. And I was like, you know what? Now I'm a BBC Earth photographer and I'm super cool, which was ridiculous at the time. But I
Mhm.
went out and it sort of was a specific spark bird, the cedar waxwing, not the coolest spark bird. A lot of people have like owls or whatever, but
Mhm.
it was just some cedar waxwings, a flock of them in a local park tree that was right by my house. And I got some horrendous photos and thought I was like the king of the world, and it was super cool. And then
Mhm.
yeah, just it progressed from there. I bought gear and got all into it, and then it like went on from there. But yeah, I guess sort of just the common wildlife around my house. I was totally blown away how cool some of the birds and wildlife looked, and then it went up from there. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I know that phase you're talking about when you feel like top of the world with like questionable photographs to say the least. Like when I started, I was going around, started in eighth grade, and I was going around my school, and I remember vividly, I had this horrible image of these two tree swallows in flight 100 yards away with this old Tamron 300 millimeter like kit lens. It was like chromatic aberration all over the photo. The photo was like purple. The swallows weren't even in focus. And I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And yeah, now I look back at it now, like you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah,
But
I'll like look
yeah.
back and I'll be like, oh, I was actually terrible, and wow,
Yeah.
that blurry photo taken on the oldest camera in my house of that blurry cedar waxwing, and then I was like, oh,
Mhm.
I'm so good. Like show my parents and be like, wow, and look back like, dude, what was I doing? I was like, what?
Yeah. Did you ever hit the watermark phase though? That's the real question.
Yeah, and it was very long because it was a small little watermark of my name, and
That's not
then
bad.
yeah, it was I kept it pretty small, and I would always blend it in with the photo, and then eventually
Mhm.
it just became part of my editing process, and that's how I differentiated my photos in my catalog as like the final edit. So then
Yeah.
a lot of my photos on Instagram that are posted have the watermark, but I always look back and be like, oh no, I don't want that there, but then I can't find like proper edit, so sometimes I just have to go with the
Deal with
watermark.
it.
But yeah, it was definitely an interesting phase.
Yeah, no, I don't think the small watermarks are that bad of an idea. And honestly, I think using it to separate it from other parts of your catalog, separate that final edit is actually a good idea. But I don't know. Have you seen my old watermark by any chance?
I think I've seen a photo. I think you've
Dude,
sent one before. I don't know.
that one's bad. I did I was like, you said you tried to blend it in with the image. I was explicitly trying to not blend it in. Like it was, I have multiple images where it's bigger than the subject, and it's not like a small in frame. It's like a portrait, and the watermark is still the main subject of the frame. Yeah, that was also not the proudest moment of my photography
Yeah.
journey. But it's mistakes you make when you're younger. Now you started off with like blurry photos and a point and shoot camera and thinking you're on top of the world and all that stuff. How did you go from there to actually turning into a pretty decent photographer? Because, I was it like, I know there's a lot of information available on YouTube and things like that. Was it mainly like learning from people on YouTube? Was it getting critiques from other wildlife photographers? How did that play out?
Yeah. So, yeah, a lot of it for the beginning, I was kind of in the dark. I wasn't like a huge social media person or anything. So I was kind of just
Mhm.
winging it for a while in the beginning there. And then podcasts were the big thing for me. I never really got into the whole YouTube stuff, but
Yeah.
I got really into podcasts like Ray Hennessy's podcast and then some other
Mhm.
people's. And then I would basically find other photographers that I would see their work and think it's really cool, and then go to their portfolios, whether that was through Instagram links or websites and stuff. And then, yeah, it was just sort of that slow process, along with, like my own learning and all that stuff. Especially, yeah, just seeing other people's portfolios and then kind of just seeing specific shots that I liked and being like, oh, how can I do this with what wildlife is around me? And
Mhm.
then learning or listening to whatever those photographers had to say about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I got you. Yeah, I feel like I always struggled when I was starting out. I really struggled with seeing a photo and then telling how people took it. I think I would need someone to like explain it to me. Does that make sense?
Mm.
Because I
Yeah, yeah,
wasn't able
yeah.
to like look at it, and that's why I was stuck in that beginner phase for 5 years. I don't, I was stuck there for a very long time. How long were you in that beginner phase?
Um, I don't really know. We definitely like under it wasn't too long. Maybe like a
Mhm.
year, maybe a little under a year. Yeah, I tried thinking of compositions relatively soon. Like after it was like definitely there was like a 6 month or 6 or 8 month point where I was really like, you know what, I need to start thinking of compositions a little bit more.
Mhm.
Um, but obviously I still wasn't good. I was still pretty bad, but it was just more of that thought, that mindset of trying to think about the shots a little more.
Yeah, no, I got you. Yeah. Did you find what were like when you were listening to these podcasts? What advice did you find the most helpful when you were starting out? Because I know for me, when I was taking advice from people, is mainly like I felt like good light and perspective. So like getting eye level were the two major things for me. I don't know if that was aligns with what you're gonna say or.
Yeah, for me, a lot of it was just like mindset type stuff, like not necessarily anything super technical, but more
Mhm.
of like how important it was to spend a lot of time in the field, or a lot of it was like the patience aspect because I was really willing to go to these locations for a really long time, but I just didn't really understand that you couldn't just be running around the whole time. You had to be kind of stationary for a little bit and then see what the wildlife would do.
Yeah.
Because I kind of just had this mindset in the beginning of going out, getting amazing photos, and then coming back. But the whole time you'd be like running around sporadically, and there'd be no
Hmm.
time to watch what the wildlife was doing. But then listening to other photographers, I'd realize like, oh, they're really like being thoughtful with it. It was more of just like a thoughtfulness that I was trying to aspire to be like, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
No, that does make sense. Yeah. I do when it comes to shorebirds, I am running around pretty frantically. I don't know about you, but when the light's getting low and
Yeah,
it's
no.
getting good.
Yeah, no, I am frantic too, definitely. I obviously I'm moving around a ton. I think it was more just like a mindset thing of I wasn't going to go out every time and get the best photos. I was going to have to like take time to really hone in my craft or whatever. And I wasn't just going to be going out and getting astonishing shots every time. It was going to take a lot more patience than I had originally thought, but I was willing to do it. So it was definitely like helpful advice.
So when you're looking at these mindset things and like being dedicated and putting the time into getting a photograph, how does that approach how does that affect how you approach a scene? So when now that you started out in the beginning phase and then you've evolved to where you are currently and you have your current style, how do you approach a scene? What are some things you look out for? Are you paying attention to the lighting, different perspectives you can get? How do you approach these different situations?
Yeah, I would say I really obviously yeah, light and perspective is a huge thing when trying to
Mhm.
get a creative shot. Obviously, focusing where the light is at a location, how it's falling over the trees or riverbanks and all that stuff. But especially, I think I noticed a lot of changes in my style and the way I would shoot when I was trying not to force it, if that makes sense. Like if I went out and got a really cool shot, that'd be great. But if not, then I would just get a cool experience in nature. I think sort of a more relaxed approach. And then also yeah, just watching the nature and the wildlife more specifically was what really started changing for me.
Mhm.
Like getting into the more wildlife tracking part of it and less of the obsessive part of getting a good photo. It's like actually watching, example, like owls or sandpipers in my area, just like actually watching their behavior and what they were doing and how they were interacting with their environment really started changing the way I would shoot. And then also just now approaching a scene, I always look for that first and foremost, like how the wildlife is interacting with its environment. And that really helped me not just focus on like, oh, I need to get really good photos every single time. So now I'm like more willing to go back to the same spot over and over again, but then gaining that knowledge of what the wildlife is doing in that area has like really helped me a lot.
Yeah, that does make sense because I feel like with some species, main one that comes to mind for me is shorebirds. It's like if you don't know their behavior, you're not going to have a lot of luck, regardless of how much photographic skill you have, because you're just going to try and walk up to them and then they're going to walk away. And then you're going to try and walk up to them again and then they're going to walk away and so on and so
Yeah.
forth into eternity. Right. Yeah. And yeah, I do feel like that is a good way to approach it when you're like, so say for example like owls or something like that, will you stick with a certain individual and go multiple times and watch it like go from perch to perch and see if it has kind of a routine and then base your photographic plan around that?
Yeah, definitely. That's like one of the things I'm really big on. Especially with certain locations. I'll spend, yeah, just ridiculous amounts of time just getting the specific individual's behavior and keeping an eye on it, or what perches that bird or wildlife subject likes the best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll more specifically with owls. Yeah, I always do it based on season. So there was a barred owl family I tracked for like a whole nesting season, and it was the same pair and going back. And that's pretty common with owls because that's how usually successful photos come. But then also with like small species too, that I've tried doing that too. There was something as simple as Carolina wrens. Not a whole lot of people care about Carolina wrens, but
I love
there was a
Carolina
couple
wrens. They're
that
the
was,
best.
yeah, no, I love them too. They're super cool, but they don't take that much tracking because they're just always hopping around. But there is one particular pair at this lake near my house that I was super, super keen on getting really cool photos and then tracking them. And it actually ended up benefiting me so much. And this was towards the beginning that I realized that the way to get like better photos was really just tracking the specific behavior of these individuals. And then
Mhm.
you kind of gain like an affinity for them. You want to go back and see if they raised their babies and how their nest
Yeah.
went that year, whatever.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a little sad. It's like, oh, their nest got washed away. Let's just move on. But most of the time it
Yeah.
ends up with like better photos and stuff. But
Mhm.
yeah.
You mentioned this is kind of like a curveball. I didn't think about this before the episode, but you mentioned your experience with tracking a barred owl family. If I'm remembering it right, didn't you have multiple like barred owl nests you like tracked into the spring and stuff like that, or was it one? And then can you like talk about some of those experiences because that sounds like a pretty cool activity.
Yeah. So there it was about a year ago, I want to say. I was like, you know what? I'm really gonna track these owls and I want to do this. And I started out actually with a great horned owl family
Mhm.
that basically hated any human absolutely so much that it was so impossible to photograph them. I would
Yeah.
spend literally there was one week I spent like over 20 hours in just like a couple days tracking them. It was ridiculous. And I don't even know if I posted or showed anyone any of the shots from those outings, but it was experience gained. So after the Great Horn debacle, I went to families of barred owls that were in my area, and then I ended up weaning it down to one barred owl family that was like really, really super calm, and they had a really beautiful habitat. That was the main thing that I really liked. A lot of the barred owls I was shooting were in cool areas, but super dark, or there was terrible lighting, or I didn't really know where their nest was. So these barred owls, they had a whole family, and it was right on the edge of the Potomac River, and it was a floodplain forest habitat. It's
Mhm.
super cool environment. So yeah, once the nesting season came, I just stuck with them, and I would check in on the other families every so often, but it was really them that I would keep going back to over and over again. And it's just super cool. Like tracking owls is so cool, as you know. Like you see them
Yeah.
randomly grabbing stuff from creeks, and especially because this was near water, they were always bathing in the water, which was super cool to see owls do, and then catching like frogs and toads and all that stuff. So yeah, tracking them was super cool. And photo wise, it was really, really like really good results, which was super fun because that's always fun. Tracking animals is fun, but then getting resulting shots is always makes it even better.
Exactly. Yeah. Do you have like one specific experience that pops into your mind with with this specific nest?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple. There was one evening I was just sitting on a log, and it was one of those evenings where I was just like super tired. I'd been in school all day,
Hmm.
and I decided to come out and then hit traffic and then was late and all these things. I was like, oh, I don't even want to be here anymore. And I was just sitting on
Yeah.
a log, kind of just watching this. It was the mom owl. The father owl wasn't. He was always out hunting, so I didn't see him as much. But the mother owl was just sitting there, and the babies were around, and then she just hopped down literally maybe 3 feet from me, if not like 2 feet, right there in front of me, and she was
That's
just sitting there for a
crazy.
while. She didn't care about me at all. And then I think she plopped down on the forest floor, grabbed, I think it was a snake or something, and then yeah, she was just like eating it right in front of me, and then went on her way. It was super cool just spending all that time with them. They eventually got comfortable enough where they would just like walk relatively close to me or fly by me. It was super cool. I remember after that I was like, oh my gosh, and I would go like every sunset for just like the whole rest of the season after that, because I was like, this is
Yeah,
so
yeah.
worth it. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Those experiences with the owls, the only one I've had like that where one was that close. I had a great gray one time, but like it wasn't in the open. It was really tall grass. And then I had my camera on it, right? But it was backlit and I was shooting with a Nikon D500 and that just didn't handle the backlit lighting scenario that well. And so I switched to
Yeah.
manual focus, right? I switched to manual focus and then it must have heard a mouse right next to me. So it flies directly at me, but I'm on manual focus, so I can't get it. And it goes over my head, and then crashes into the grass right next to me, like 5 feet away. But it wasn't as cool because like I couldn't clearly see it. It just I could see its wings sticking out of the grass and its kind of head moving around in the grass, you know? Um, yeah, but barred owls are just incredible, you know, and I find they're generally pretty chill. Great horns, on the other hand, like you were saying, I don't know if it's the same for you guys down here, but like, I mean, down there, but up in Massachusetts, it's like they're always way up in pine trees. Half the time, they're so skittish for no reason. And then even when they're not, they're like a mile up. So the shot is super difficult and they come out super late. I don't know. Did you run into experiences like that with them?
Yeah, me and Great Horn are not great friends, Like
Yeah.
they're so cool and they look awesome up close, but yeah, sort of the same thing you're saying. And the annoying thing about the family that I was tracking was they actually would come down on the forest floor and stuff and they would
Oh,
be pretty
really?
low. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So it made me want to spend even more time with them. But then it was always branches in the way if they were low on the ground, or they would just immediately see me and then start flying up. And I was like, I don't want to freak these guys out too much. So it was just worth my time elsewhere. But it was annoying because they would be so low on the ground and I'd be like, oh my gosh, this is my chance. And then it just
Mhm.
never worked out.
Yeah, I no, honestly, great horns. So I like mentally rank owls in like a list of which ones I like the best. And my top, I'm sure it's the same for you. Like the top four on my list always change. You know, it's always changing around. But what's pretty consistent is great horns are always kind of near the bottom of that list. And
Yeah.
it's because like when you actually pay attention to them and look at them, they're super cool owls. They're insane. But when it comes to actually getting experiences with them, they're just so hard to work with. I remember I had out in Montana when I was going to college out there, I had one in a cemetery, and that thing was really good to work with. It wasn't super chill, but all the trees were pretty low. I remember one time I was looking for deer and I accidentally flushed it off a gravestone. Like it was just sitting on the gravestone hunting squirrels. And of course,
Oh, whoa.
I didn't realize until I saw something big flying out my peripheral vision. I realized it was on this huge gravestone, but I was able to get it like 15 feet off the ground hunting a squirrel like 45 feet from me. So after that happened, I was like, man, these things are way cooler than I thought they were. But then I came back to Massachusetts and they're all way up in pine trees. And I'm like, no, they're still near the bottom, near the bottom of my list, you know.
Yeah.
Do you wait, what are your top three owls if you had to choose right now?
Hmm. I would probably say Barred Owl. Barred Owl, I don't know if they're the coolest looking, but they're definitely the best personality wise. Like they're so cool.
Mm-hmm.
Barred Owl, and then Screech Owl, and then Burrowing Owl would probably be mine.
Do you have experience with burrowing
But
owls?
yeah, not a whole lot. I tried photographing them a bit on some trips, and then yeah, actually it was kind of an unfortunate story. I was photographing this family burrowing owls on public land, and I was just there, and it was at sunset, and then I'd kind of been waiting. I had gotten there when the light was a little harsher, so I really wanted some golden hour shots and all the different stuff with urban lights too, because it was a nice urban area. And then
Yeah.
literally right as the sun got low enough to take half decent shots, this random dude who came out on like his truck started yelling at me, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, you need to leave this area." And I was like, "Oh, it's actually public area for burrowing owls." And he was like, "Oh, I don't really care about that." And then I was like, "Okay, maybe I'll just move to this burrow that's a little bit further down." And then I moved, and then he like chased his car up and then came back and started yelling at me.
What?
And then I was like, "What is going on?" And then I had to leave to a different burrow. And then by the time I actually got there, it was completely dark. I was so mad. I was like, "Oh my gosh, this guy." I don't really know. He seemed a little interesting, but I tried being as nice as I could, even though I was like, dude, this is totally fine. This is for birds. This has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
But it was fine. I ended up being able to shoot meadowlarks that evening.
Mhm.
Because there were some that were near this really, really brightly lit spot. So that it ended up not being a total flop. But I do really like burrowing owls because the bit I have gotten to see them, they're super cool.
Yeah. Oh, that's rough, man. Was he so did he say he was a landowner? What was he just angry that you were having fun? What was the problem?
Um, I genuinely have no idea. He didn't really give any reason. He didn't even mention anything about me being a photographer or anything. He literally was just yelling at me, and then he was walking really close to me, and I was like, okay, this is kind of weird. And I'm also in a place I don't really know, like what is going on. And he didn't say
Yeah.
anything. He just like kicked me out. And I was like, dude, what? This is a random field. You have like what? It was fine though. I was like, okay, I guess I'll just move.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I my experience with burrowing owls has not been I love them, but I've only seen them very briefly in Badlands National Park on this little random dirt road. And the issue is it's not like I'm assuming you were in Florida when you got these guys, right?
Yeah, Florida.
Yeah, so this is like huge open prairie, and the problem I had was like they were pretty skittish. And I remember I was, driving down the road and I look and there was one right next to the car and I was on a road trip with my mom and I was like, "Oh, burrowing owl." But then she hit the brakes. It was on a gravel road, so it like disappeared. And then the best look we
Oh,
got at them was like 200 yards away. So, rough, but it was still super great seeing them. But earlier that morning also there was a when we were looking for them, the sun had just come up and all the prairie dogs had come out of the burrows. And I see this thing running through the prairies. I'm like, that's a big prairie dog. And it was a badger and golden, like pink light.
oh
So
no way.
I jump out of the car, I lie down, I start snapping shots, and it's cruising, it's moving fast, it disappears. I look at my shots all excited, and it's all of them motion blur. Like all of them were ruined.
Oh no.
It was so bad. So
Oh,
yeah,
that's
it
so
sounds
unfortunate.
yeah, it sounds like we've both had rough burrowing owl experiences, but I got to get down to Florida because that sounds incredible. Now, you go out to like locations and stuff. Do you find that more often than not you're going out with a plan as opposed to just going out and doing random stuff? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I definitely go out with a plan most of the time. Obviously, I think it's great to not go out with a plan and just kind of wing it and see what's there if it's a new place. But in
Mm-hmm.
general, especially if it's a location I'm revisiting, I'll definitely have ideas or a plan sort of where I want to go, what time I want to be there. Especially around, I always have specific compositions I kind of want to see if I can pull off.
Yeah.
For example, Great Falls Park is like pretty close to my house, and it's just a bunch of different waterfalls feeding into the river and all these cool streams and stuff. And there's a ton of wading birds and a bunch
Oh
of
yeah.
other different types of birds, but especially wading birds. So I remember this one spring, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna get, and I had a couple really specific ideas that I wanted to do there, especially with like long exposure images and slower shutter speeds and stuff. And I had to go so much to pull these shots off because there was either always tourists there that were scaring the herons away because it's a really popular spot,
Mm-hmm.
or the herons would be sitting on like the weirdest bush and I couldn't see them. But then, yeah, just going back over and over with like a specific shot in mind actually ended up being super beneficial. And it was super cool because, yeah, long exposure shots are really fun when you actually get the opportunity to shoot them. But yeah, definitely planning has been like super beneficial for photography.
Yeah, those shots. Those are the ones with like the huge like waves, not waves, but like huge rapids in the background that are all blurred with the herons standing there. That's where you're getting those, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, those are sick. Those are awesome. I love those. Yeah, I've noticed similar thing that you're saying, like going back to a place repeatedly with a single shot kind of in mind or a single kind of general idea. For me, when I was doing my shorebird stuff this past summer, so the first summer I kind of did it. This is when I started becoming a better photographer. So I was doing just a lot of basically as long as it was eye level and it wasn't harsh light, I was like, great. And then
Yeah.
after that point, the next summer, so not this past summer, but the one before that, I was really focused on backlit golden hour. I was obsessed with that. And then this past one that we just finished, it was all almost all blue hour bokeh because I just upgraded to a mirrorless setup.
Okay.
So I was so focused on getting like artificial bokeh at blue hour. And I had a handful of shots that I kind of wanted. Two of them I really wanted. One of them I kind of half got, but the other one I wanted was like a bird next to a just massive ball of bokeh. So, but like mostly full frame, so I didn't have to crop a lot. and it took me most of the season. But what happened was, I got to a pair of turns, lease turns, spent like 25 minutes inchworm crawling up to them until I got minimum focusing
Oh
distance.
man.
It was incredible. And then the cars, there's like a parking lot where people will like sit at sunset on the other side of the water on the inlet.
Okay,
And
yeah, yeah.
these guys, usually it's too dark for car bokeh at the point it was at. Cause like car headlights can be pretty strong, right? Um,
Yeah.
but I was so close to the bird that I was able to kind of dilute it enough. So I just got the turn with this massive bokeh ball that the bird could literally fit inside. So that's what it took me like an entire summer to get that, but that's what I was working towards. And I think that is kind of a valuable tactic. When you go out into the field without a plan, how does that work? Like what are you keeping an eye out for? Or are you just completely just going out with no expectations? Because I know I do that sometimes.
Yeah, I always make sure I'm paying attention to like the little environmental cues or like the little cues that are around when I'm going to a new place. Because if it's like somewhere totally new, if you haven't done any planning before, it's kind of like, oh, what am I supposed to do?
Mhm.
So I'm always paying attention to like the small things. Obviously, like how the light is falling and how some of the shots might look if I get an opportunity. But especially just like sometimes focusing on the smallest things has led to me being able to track certain birds for so long. For example, there was this one mud flat near my house. It was a pretty crappy area in terms of like aesthetic look. It looked really weird. But
Yeah.
I went there one time and I noticed literally the most minor thing. There was a couple feathers on the rim of some shorebirds. And I was like, oh, and I tried to ID the feathers. It didn't go super well, but I knew that they were shorebirds. So I just went back the next time. And then there was like a whole flock of all these shorebirds there. And then just going back more and more, I was able to understand their routine and then get some cool fog photos there. But it was something super minor. It's just like feathers sitting in the mud, but and it was a
Mhm.
place I hadn't really shot at that much, but just kind of noticing that ended up being pretty fruitful. So I find for me, it's always like the small little cues that nature's leaving to like what might be there and stuff is always really helpful.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier, like if you're at a new location and you haven't planned for it, like you can't really do anything. But like if you're going to a new location, are you consciously thinking about how you would formulate a plan for your next outing there? Because I know I'll do that sometimes. If I'm going to a new spot, I'll really pay attention to what wildlife is there, what is there, where the light direction is coming in at sunrise or sunset, et cetera, et cetera. So, what are some things that you like pay attention to at a new location if you want to make a plan for your next outing?
Yeah. So yeah, sort of what you were saying. Light is a huge one, especially how light falls. And definitely when I'm in the woods and stuff, that's the biggest one is how the light is falling. Because some areas are just gonna get really dark really fast, and I'll keep that in mind. And then yeah, a lot of times if it's like a more coastal area, how the tides are rising and falling, that's a big one too, because then there's more
Yeah.
exposed like feeding grounds and stuff. And then yeah, just what animals are there at different times. It's always funny because if I go to a new location and then see, a couple birds, maybe some mammals here, and then the lights falling nice, I'll come home and have all these like super, super specific ideas for shots that like there's no way I'm gonna actually be able to pull some of those off. And I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
this is my new motivation, and
Hmm.
this is how I'm gonna like. When I first started going to more urban areas here in Ohio, or Pennsylvania area, like this whole Midwest area. I started going to Pittsburgh and I was like, you know what? I want a really cool shot with this bird on this row of trees with this skyline at this time. And I'm like, you know what? I don't actually know if I'm going to be able to pull any of this off, but it keeps me motivated.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, cool. Now I have a couple shots I have in mind. And then you always end up getting other stuff that's equally as cool that you didn't plan for in terms of photos. So it ends up working out.
Hmm. It is really important, just like when you're going to a new spot, to just kind of like pay attention to all those things, even if like you have the ideas that you can't actually flesh out. Like I know I've had that happen. Like I'll go to like a location, I'll come up with the craziest scenarios for photos, like the most
Yeah.
insane. They don't even make any sense. Like the great horned owl. Um, there was all these insane shot ideas I had with that. The one that was at that cemetery and or no, like in the cemetery, same cemetery. I remember I had ran into a bear one time at night, so I couldn't take any photos of it. It was like, oh, not night. But it was super dark, like 20 minutes after sundown in a pretty
Yeah.
heavily forested part of the cemetery. After that had happened, I was coming up with all of these crazy ideas for bear sightings and like bear photos. And then I never saw another
Yeah.
bear. I never saw another bear at that cemetery for the
Yeah.
rest of the school year. So yeah, but it gives you motivation to go out and kind of get out there, because it's like if you don't have that motivation, it's like, you just don't even want to go. Now, if you like make a plan for when you're out shooting, right? What are some like specific, if you have like a specific plan for a location you want to go to, what are some specific actionable steps that might be in that plan?
The first thing, if I'm shooting near any body of water, is always like how I can get access to that water. That's always the biggest one for me for some reason. If it's like a lake, like where the tree cover
Mm-hmm.
is,
Yeah.
or a lot of times, especially I do a lot of work during the spring and summer at the Chesapeake Bay. So that's always the biggest one there is like, how am I going to get access to the water? So like getting a paddle board out there, a kayak or something. And then from there is kind of always like what time I want to be there, how, like how are the tides at that specific location, or something even as simple as just like when are the birds going to be there. That sounds so dumb and like obvious, but I've planned all this stuff out before and then been like, oh wait, I've only ever seen birds in this location during noon, and then I show up at like perfect golden hour and there's absolutely nothing and they've all gone to a different feeding spot, and I'm like, ooh, I probably should have paid attention to where the actual subjects are going because that would be important.
Yeah.
um
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's always like how I'm going to actually get in the spot I want to be. And then once I'm there, just kind of figuring out how to like shoot it the way I want to. Especially with some of the areas I've been, they're just so hard access wise. Um, there was one area with, I was working with loons over the summer, up north near actually like the Massachusetts area or like a little further north than that. And this lake was oddly, it was super urban. And most of the time I had seen loons and had been in more desolate areas, but it was a super urban lake, which actually made it more difficult because there was always boats going by and stuff and then freaking out the
Yeah.
loons. And I'd be like, oh, I would go to photograph the loons and then some kids would like tube by, which is great. I love tubing, but then the loons would freak out and I'd be like, so this might be harder than I thought.
Mm-hmm.
So then, yeah, I like going out in the morning because going out at sunset just wasn't an option. And then, yeah, that one was weird though, because I was basically on a tiny little paddle board and then balancing like all my gear, and I had telephoto and wide angle that I would switch between. So I was literally like standing there. There's
Dude.
loon, they were super chill. So they're just sitting in front of me. And then I was switching between lenses. And there was always like that 2 second period. I'm like, okay, if one of these lenses or my body falls in, I'm like inches away from the water. This better. And I'm like sitting in like 30 feet of water. And like, okay, I'm literally praying that this works out. Um, but yeah, it's always like those actionable steps of like, okay, I gotta get there using like this random mode of like water paddle boat. Like it's always like the most random stuff, but
Yeah.
it ends up working.
How do you feel the paddleboard like handled for this? Because I do a lot of work with loons up at a certain lake up in New Hampshire, and I usually bring out a kayak. But the issue is, I'm sure you can get low in a kayak, but you can't get like low. Like that's, you can't like get water level, which is what I like to do. And I've thought about paddle boards, but that's nerve wracking, man. Like I don't want to have to go for a swim to retrieve a camera so then I can use it for proof that my camera actually got broken so I can get insurance money for it. How do you like how was it super difficult to do? Did you just tough through it or was it actually pretty intuitive once you started doing it?
Yeah, so I've done it a couple times, both with loons, and then I usually use paddle boards out on the bay. So it was
Oh,
definitely more
really?
nerve-wracking. Yeah, it was definitely
Mhm.
more nerve-wracking at first, but it was worth it for me for like the perspective I could get, and I could move around a little more. Like I love kayaking, but sometimes it's a little weird. Like you're just kind of sitting there, you can't move your legs a whole lot.
Yeah, yeah.
But obviously there's some areas that you need a kayak. But yeah, I getting over the initial fear, it actually ended up being pretty fruitful in terms of like getting better looks and photos and stuff.
Mhm.
But I was also doing it in like calm water in these areas. Like if there's even like the most minor ripple, I'm always like, oh my gosh, and I'm like bracing my legs. I'm like, please don't fall in. I
Yeah.
also have like a water resistant bag, like a water bag on my back, and I'll keep my extra lenses and gear in there. So if that
Uh-huh.
falls in, it's at least like it'll inflate and stuff and save my gear. But it's kind of like the camera body and lens that I'm holding that's the issue. But yeah, after the initial fear, it actually ends up being pretty intuitive and it's okay. And you like get in the zone and stuff. But yeah, there was sometimes that speedboats would come by, especially if I was trying to photograph at like sunset where more people are out. Speedboats would come by and I would
Yeah.
just be like, okay, this is when my gear never sees the light of day again because this is
Mhm.
not going to go well. But yeah.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I haven't experienced it on a paddleboard, but when I've been out kayaking, this lake is also pretty urban. It's not like in the middle of the city or anything, but there's like a lot of like lake vacation houses on this lake to the point where it's like a ton. Like there's a lot of them. And man, the speedboats in the afternoon, it's ridiculous. Like I'm trying to paddle around and then I'm just getting thrown around like these 2.5 foot wakes and I'm bobbing like a buoy. And then there's like jet skis and boats, and then there's a loon, and then the loon moves out to the middle of the lake, and then there's wind, and so there's actual natural waves on top of the wakes, and it's like this. I remember I just gave up one time. I was trying to photograph a loon. It was golden hour at sunset. I literally just gave up. I'm like, I'm not doing this. It's not worth it. It was I couldn't even. I would need like a massive anchor to even hold myself in place. Yeah. Do you go out in sunrise for it mostly, or because I find that's the best time to go out.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely mostly sunrise with that stuff. Same with going on the Chesapeake. Usually sunrise is better. Just because it's also just calmer in general, like less wind. It's calmer. There'll be more birds.
Mm-hmm.
Also sometimes the way the tides work, it just works out better that way. Anyways. But yeah, there are some times where just even the wind is annoying. Like there was this osprey I was trying to shoot this one time, and it was relatively far away, but literally the light was setting perfectly right over it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the best opportunity. And I finally get in position, and then the wind just like boop, blew me so fast to the side. And I was like, dang it. So
Yeah.
then I like paddle over and I get back, and it just like did the same thing again. And I got a
Mhm.
couple frames. They were okay, but it was so annoying. I had to do it like 8 times. Then by the time I finally get like right in position, it's like the sun is already lower than I need it to be anyways. I'm like, oh my gosh. So there's
Yeah.
definitely like a risk and reward there.
Hmm. No, yeah, it's the wind is brutal. I remember what happened. Also, I had something with loons. I had a loon that was super chill, like really chill. And the wind, it didn't have chicks, right? So there were some loons on the lake that had chicks. And I remember there was people like really upset with photographers because photographers were getting close to them and stuff. So I knew that people on the lake were already kind of like mad at photographers. And the wind started blowing me close to this loon, and the loon's chilling. Like the loon didn't care, but I'm starting to get close to this loon, and I really wanted to get that super close portrait, but I ended up backing up because I was like, man, I don't want to get like shot at or something because I'm close to this loon, you know?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I'm surprised you do it out on the ocean. I'm surprised it's not. I mean, I guess it works if the water's calm. It just seems scary, you know.
Yeah, I usually stay away from like the bigger portions of the bay, kind of like the smaller like inlets or something.
Okay.
Those tend to work out a little bit better than going. If I'm going out further, I'll definitely do a kayak or something.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, no, yeah, loons are cool. They're really chill. I had some that were like swimming right under my board and then coming
Oh,
up like
that's
relatively close, which
sweet.
was super cool. Um, Yeah, it was always a hassle changing lenses though. I'm always like, oh my gosh, and then like they're there and I have the wrong lens on. I'm like, oh my gosh, and you end up getting the photos in the end, but there's always like that moment of like scrambling, and then you also just want to look at it. Sometimes I just like put my gear down and I'm like, you know what, I'm not gonna be able to change this in time. I might as well just enjoy this.
Hmm. Yeah, no. I mean, I would say take out two bodies so you have two lenses on hand, but that's just more risk, you know?
Yeah, I have I tried. I don't know if I've tried that. Yeah, I'll do that like normally though. Sometimes 'cause it's like more beneficial because it's like okay, might as well not change all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. Also, what you're mentioning earlier with tides, that's a pretty big thing too. That's going to drastically change the behavior of the stuff you're photographing. I'm sure you're aware. It's weird. Most people like low tide because you get more species there feeding and stuff. I photograph breeding piping plovers and breeding least terns mainly. I really like high tide because there's less beach space for the birds to be. All the sand is dry.
Yeah.
I find it's easier to navigate and it's less soaking wet and cold, because when it's low tide and the tide just came out, if you don't have waders or anything on, you're just going out in normal clothes, all the sand is soaking wet. You're going to go home completely covered in seawater that's cold. And, but I'm going to have to do it more because I just had a friend that went there. I've never had any luck at low tide with anything crazy, but I had a friend that went this last spring. They got like breeding plumage dunlins and all this crazy stuff. So I'm going to have to give that a shot.
No, yeah, with the low tide stuff, it's always weird because I was shooting at the Delaware Bay this one time, and I was working mostly with like sanderlings and then also breeding plumage dunlin. And yeah, you mentioned getting cold. I was kind of newer to like figuring out the tide thing. I was getting there with photography, but the whole tide thing was still throwing me off. So I show up and it's like a huge low tide, and I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna run to the very edge because that makes sense in my mind. So I run out there and I'm just at the edge, and then literally didn't pay attention to myself at all because there were so many birds around, and it was really cool because they ended up being pretty chill. So I got some cool like sand lines moving, and then
Oh yeah,
some
yeah.
other cool like whiting stuff. um but there was one time I went that I actually like got hypothermia, which was so not fun
Oh, no
because
kidding.
I literally did not realize I was so in the zone. This was so stupid on my part. I was like so in the zone that I was like waist deep in like this really thick like quicksandy mud, and then I get out and I was there with my dad who was also doing some birding. He was like, you're literally purple. I don't know what is wrong with you." And I was like, "Oh, I like can't feel my hands or my feet." And then I had to like revive my body heat on this beach. And I had gotten like really cool photos, so I didn't care. I was like, "Oh, this was worth it." And my dad was like, "I don't think it was because you're literally like dying."
Yeah.
And then this all these people were on the beach and they were like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like sitting there like taking off my shirt while wrapping myself in like a blanket. It was so bad. So yeah, definitely my advice to people is always like, hey, watch out for tides because going out in shorts and a t-shirt in April is really dumb. So
Yeah, no, yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. That's rough. The closest thing I've had happen, worst thing I've had happen while doing shorbs, I think. Let me think about this. I did have one time, usually when it's early in the season, so like March and April, I usually wear waders. And like I'll get like if there's a cool subject I want to see, I'll definitely go like in the cold mud. Like I don't care if there's something I want to see and photograph it, like I'll do it.
yeah.
But I usually wear waders. I remember this one time there was a sanderling and it was backlit and it wasn't anything too crazy, but this was my first time seeing a sanderling for the season. Or well, no. It's
Mm.
actually they were leaving. They were leaving. So this was early spring, but I hadn't shot them all winter. So I was super excited. And I was just like lying in the water. Like I was like in the waves. So I had to lift up my camera to like,
Oh
get out
yeah.
of that.
The like camera
Yeah.
dash.
Yeah, because like it was like filling up my waders and everything. Well, not filling up my waders, but it was almost getting up to them. But I remember I was in New York with a couple friends back in August. I was completely in the zone, as you were saying, getting the artificial bokeh, like Blue Hour had came in, and I was like
Mm.
really in the zone because they had pretty much they were just kind of done, but like this was my favorite time of the day. I'm like I was so focused on the bokeh,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
I turn around, and there's this massive wave just coming at me full speed. So I try to get up and run because I've been normal close. So I try to get up and run, and I fall, and then the wave just completely gets the lower half of me, and I had to go get pizza because we got food after. I had to go get
Yeah.
pizza, and I was covered in sand and water, and it was rough. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, but
At a
not
certain
as
point, you just have to like acknowledge the fact that you're gonna be like a mess. Sometimes you're like, okay, this is the point of no return. I am literally, yeah, I've showed up to like nice cafes on the beach side, like just drenched, and I'm like, oh, this is really bad. But at this point, like I can't do
yeah.
anything about it.
Honestly, yeah, it's more interesting, It makes people think, wonder about you. Yeah, the closest I've had to like having an actual bad encounter, like actual bad. I wasn't close to like a bad health thing, but when I was photographing my bobcats, a couple winters ago, it was minus
Mm,
one
yeah,
or
yeah.
minus three, no wind chill, something like that. And
Dang.
I was in the zone. Like I was so focused because it's a bobcat in front of me in the snow. Like it
Yeah.
was insane. And I realized when I got in the car, I couldn't feel my right pinky toe. And it was 45 minutes. I could not feel it. And I was starting to get worried. Like it was genuinely no feeling. And it came back. So thankfully I didn't lose it. It would have been worth it, man. Bobcats, I would have
Yeah,
taken
you're
it.
like, it's a bobcat in the snow.
It's a pinky toe. I don't need that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the last thing I want to talk about, because we're kind of coming up on the hour here, is how much research do you do prior to going to a new location? Like if you're about to go, like especially on a trip, are you doing a lot of e-birding? Are you doing a lot of like do you do any? I know some people will do like crazy Google Maps stuff and check like tree lines and stuff like that. How much research are you actually doing before you go to these spots?
Um, I would say like a decent amount. I'm not huge on eBird. I'll look at eBird kind of like vaguely just to make sure that there actually is cool birds there. It's not like
Yeah.
totally dead.
Hmm.
Because that's happened before. I've gone places and not looked at anything and then be like, oh, there's actually no wildlife. But yeah, so
Yeah.
I like vaguely look at eBird and then kind of get like a feel for the species that are around that area. And then yeah, I always end up doing like weird like back end ways to kind of scout out a location before I go. Like I've even looked at like hotel stuff on Google Maps or something and then like seen the view or like kind of what you were saying, like weird things that actually
Yeah.
end up being pretty beneficial. Obviously, like reaching out to people that live in that area and seeing if they know any good spots. Although sometimes I try to avoid that one because location sharing can get like weird sometimes.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, like doing weird like back end things actually ends up being pretty helpful. Google Maps or there's always like that frantic when I first get there. It's like the frantic first hour of like just making sure, especially if I don't have a lot of time, especially with traveling, I'll make sure like, okay, this is where everything is. And then you got to be frantic and then the light gets good and you have to like actually focus.
Mhm.
But yeah, beforehand, just like, yeah, more like obviously looking at eBird and some stuff, but then yeah, those like other like Google Maps or talking to people is always like super helpful.
Yeah. So if you had to like, let's say for like the last question here, if you could take your top three research suggestions for new locations, what would be those top three things that any viewer listening to this could implement into like actionable steps for like a place they'd want to go to in the future?
Hmm. Yeah. First one, I would say, yeah. I mean, I think this one's obvious, but like eBird or any other like birding, like whether that's like a group chat or like people you know within like the community of like photographers, that one's always big because you want there to actually be wildlife. Um,
Mhm.
Number two for me is always weather and then like how the weather impacts that place. That one's a
Mhm.
little more specific and it takes a little bit longer for me, but I'm always huge on like, okay, how much does it rain in this general area? And I'll like try to find photos of it and be like, okay, is it gonna flood here, especially with like tides and stuff, or yeah, when I was big on that when I went to Hawaii. I was like super researching the weather of these places I was going to because I knew it
Mhm.
was like more tropical or whatever, and I wanted it to like know what gear I needed to bring in that sort of thing. So yeah, weather's a big one for me. I'm always huge on that. And then yeah, I think the way the light falls is also really important. But that one's a little harder to do before. There are some apps though. I haven't really used any of them, but there are apps that like help with how the light's gonna move around an area. Um, but then like obviously timing is huge. Also parking. I don't know, that's always weird. That seems
Yeah.
that seems obvious, but I've like maybe I shouldn't. Well, I've like had to end up sneaking into a place a couple times, which isn't, I would not advise that to anyone, but like make sure you actually know where to park because I've gone to some places and I've been like, oh, this whole thing is actually completely gated off and I can't get in here, or I've not been able to get out. I got locked in at a beach one time and I was locked in
Oh
there for like
man.
30 minutes because I stayed too
Mhm.
late for, like the blue hour Boca. And I was like, okay, sweet. Car parked great, but I didn't look at the times before when they like closed the gates and they had these
Mhm.
huge gates that just like slammed shut. And then I walked out and there was no one there. And I was like, oh, I guess I'm just sleeping on a beach in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, I ended up calling the number and some pissed off ranger came and she's like, what the heck are you doing here? And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. So like knowing hours of operation and parking seems super obvious, but I have had so many run-ins with that is always like very key on my mind now. I'm like, hey, don't want to have to sneak past some park rangers that are going to later get really mad at me because that would be bad.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's I've never had the gate shut on me before. One of my main places, it has gates that shut, but they auto open. So they won't auto open if you're
Oh,
coming
that's
in,
nice.
but if you're going out, they'll always auto open for you. Sometimes I get worried that they won't. Like I'll pull up to the gate one day and it just like denies it. Um, no, but yeah, that's rough. That could be rough. I think so. That's all the questions I had. Was there anything else you wanted to add on before we wrap it up?
um yeah, not anything super specific.
Mhm.
Yeah, my big thing is whenever people ask me about like locations is always like don't ignore anything that like don't ignore the stuff that you would usually ignore like for new locations. Like sometimes I've walked by like really, really common species and I'm like, oh, I see that all the time. But then I go for the rest of the shoot and I don't see anything. And I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have ignored that. Especially at new places. Like you have all these big ideas. Like I went to one spot when I was visiting I think Alaska. I think I forget where. It was like a more yeah, I think it was Alaska on that trip. And I looked at eBird and there was all these super cool things. I was like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be the best shoot of my life. And then nothing was there except for this like little sandpiper. And I was like, oh, that's so annoying. But I ended up getting really cool shots from that. So, like not ignoring the super common species is like actually beneficial, which took me way too long to realize, but.
Yeah, awesome. Well, that was a lot of fun. I had a good time. I hope there's a lot of value that the viewers could get out of that. Thank you for coming on, and thank you guys for listening. And I will see you guys on the next episode.